Hello, I'm Sarah Montague from The World at One.
And I'm Evan Davis from the PM programme.
Evan and I sit a row of desks apart in our newsroom, and there are many news stories we talk about. When it comes to economic ones, I'll often go and pick his brains. This week, with President Macron's state visit to the UK, we found ourselves comparing the UK with France, something even the King referred to at the state banquet.
We would not be neighbours if we did not have our differences. This is a relationship built not only on cooperation and mutual fascination, but also on amicable competition.
So, in the interests of that healthy rivalry, who does win? The UK or
It's so
France?
interesting because ever since I was a precocious sixth former studying economics, Sarah, I've always found myself thinking of France as the real benchmark nation for sort of how the British are doing as the kind of competitor, because we're the same size. We have virtually identical populations. We're both these kind of European powers with our seats on the UN Security Council, with post-imperial kind of challenges. So much similarity. And the amazing thing is that we're pretty well identical sized economies. You know, we are, sometimes the French are a bit ahead. I think we've been a little bit ahead, but it often depends which measure of GDP you're using. We've both struggled a bit with growth over the last 10, 15 years. The French, and the British have not seen massive growth. So it's a really, really interesting comparison. But here's the central challenge. We're the same size economy. We work a lot more hours than the French do. OK, we work more hours. I think the average employee works 1,670 here. The average French employee works 1,514, depends which employees you're talking about. But look, we work more hours and we have the same size economy and the same population. And that means the French are more productive per hour worked. So somehow we do more work, they do more productive work, and that's how we end up being the same.
I mean, I've got the stats in front of me here. Productivity per hour. This is 2023, actually. UK 70, it's in dollars, $78. France $88.
It's an amazing difference.
And it's made even more amazing when you think that GDP per capita, the UK is almost $10 higher than France. So we really are working so much longer in order to get that, aren't we?
And actually, the per capita GDP figures, they're all over the place because it depends which measure you're using. But yes, so something is going wrong here, that we're working more and less productively than the French, and something's going right there. And I think it's worth focusing on some of the explanations that have been given. And the most interesting, and I think this is the biggest difference between France and the UK, for all the similarities, there's one massive difference. Same population, they have twice the land area. And so they have half the population density. And what does that mean economically? This first actually emerged in a really fascinating paper written by a guy called Steve Nicol back in the late 90s, who was the first guy, I think, to equate productivity and land mass. And he basically did lots of work on specific sectors and found that one of the things in France was, for example, it's just easier to get permission to build a new building. It's just they're less worried about preserving every inch of the land. And it meant, for example, French hotels were kind of new and purpose-built and rectangular. And it meant you could clean rooms in French hotels 20 minutes quicker. Yeah, exactly. Just Ibis-type things. British hotels are lovely old country houses and pubs with sort of creaky corridors and fire doors and stairs going up and round corners. And it just meant that it took longer to clean a hotel room in the UK than in France because we didn't build as much new hotel as the French. And there's now a lot of people saying actually land use and the inability to build big, sprawling factories and we build them on 3 levels is a part of the productivity problem here.
Okay, does it also apply to sort of our inability to build a train line versus the French or roads?
Well, that one is that would, I think, be the second difference between the British and French, because this is a second and different one, that the French just invest more than we do. They build more.
On top of being relaxed about the land.
On top of being... Now, there's a connection because they're relaxed about the land, so they can build more. But here's another, I think, really interesting difference between the two of us. If you think of our national income, some of it we spend as households on holidays and supermarket goods. And in the UK, 60% of our national income is spent by households. It's our private consumption, 60%. And then the other 40% is things like the NHS and schools and defence and business investment. All of that is spending that isn't ours, personal spending. So we spend 60% ourselves and 40% goes on everything else. In France, household consumption is closer to 52%. So they as households are not getting as much national income. And the rest of national income is being spent on other things like public services and business investment and public sector investment. That kind of is why I think some state functions there feel like they work better than here.
Okay, but that's affecting the income as well. I mean, isn't it?
Well, that can be in lower incomes that people are getting, or it can be in higher taxes.
But they're getting more from the state because they're getting, whether it's healthcare, education.
Exactly.
I mean, schools is...
It's just the difference in the amount that households have in their pockets to spend themselves versus other stuff that the economy is doing outside of the household sector.
But is it still the case? I always remember somebody saying that basically the French come to the UK to earn their fortune and the British go to France to spend theirs.
And there's a bit of truth to that, isn't there? I mean, we know people who go to France and retire.
There certainly was, I think, pre-Brexit as well. But I wondered if post-Brexit that is still the case, whether there are as many French people here. I mean, London used to be, the sixth...
capital,
the sixth largest French city.
I mean, I don't know what's happened. I imagine it's probably trailed off. It's a little bit harder to get in, and obviously we do know a lot of EU citizens in the UK did return around the time of the pandemic and haven't come back. But that was basically there were opportunities in London to get jobs in the financial sector and the services sector.
Which possibly don't exist
paid very
now.
well. It has to be said, though, by the way, that is another similarity between us, is Paris and London are very dominant in the two economies.
You haven't declared an interest here because you talk about yourself being a precocious teenager who was obsessed with France. You are now married to a Frenchman and have a house in France.
Yes, this is
so you see it right up.
I do. And I'll tell you what I actually observed, which is another similarity, Sarah, which is a kind of undercurrent of it's broken, it's not working, and sort of people grumbling. I mean, there is a sort of... Well, you had it with
very
Gilets jaunes. You have a populist challenge to an unpopular mainstream government in France. There's a political paralysis is too strong a word, but there's a political deadlock in the assembly in France, no one able to get a majority. So you do have some of those similarities of these European states that are, if you like, struggling to feel good about themselves and struggling to feel they've found their place and their mojo in the modern world, which is another fascinating comparison.
Okay. I mean, I've just realised, of course, that you are choosing to live here, but I bet you're going to retire there.
No, I don't think I'd retire.
There we go.
No, I would stay here.
Surely that's where this question is ultimately, where would you choose to live? Now, clearly there are other factors like
I would choose
family.
To live here. I love it here, and I would choose to live here. But I would love to go there because there's a lot to like about the French way of life, and lots of Brexity Britons who, were quite happy to vote to leave, love going there, the village life, the country life, more space, better infrastructure, beautiful food and wine and cheese. And so there is a lot to love about retiring in France. And I think a lot of people would regard the French health system as functioning quite a bit better than the British one. But I love it here. I'm not.
Do you think?
Anywhere.
I mean, we are in post-Brexit world where obviously we have separated. But given what is happening with President Trump in the White House, and we had President Macron this week talking about the UK and Europe needs to reduce its dual dependency on the US and China, which would suggest that we need to work closer together.
Well, I mean, that's going to raise all sorts of thoughts about, is he talking about Britain going back into the EU or Britain getting closer to the EU? But I don't think it needs to mean that. But what is absolutely clear is the two countries, Britain and France, and indeed other European countries, share some of the same challenges, that we do look like we might be buffeted around between the United States, a single country with a sort of an economic might similar to that of the European Union, and China, which is the biggest or second biggest population in the world. And Europe sort of does need to work out how much of its own industry it wants, how much it's willing just to be a kind of buying from the Chinese as much as the Chinese want to sell. So I think it's a similarity between UK and France, that we just face some thoughts and challenges about what do we do, where do we go in the world, you know?
Now, which is picked up by Alistair Heath in The Telegraph today. I don't know if you've read it. He writes of the decline and fall of both, saying their economies barely growing, their industries hollowed out, their welfare states horrendously expensive, copying each other's worst pathologies. I mean, his whole point is that instead of finding a way out of these empires falling, that actually they're copying the worst of.
Yeah, and that look, both Britain and France and other European countries do face challenges about how they make themselves economically dynamic, where they can be creating startups and creating companies that are valuable, how they can do that without becoming, like the United States, and aspects of US life with destitution and less protection and less of a social safety net, how you can become dynamic without being the United States and just somehow get growth back, because both of us and lots of European countries have been struggling to grow. And the US has found itself as the sort of hub of modern technology and the big powers of the world. And, you've seen this week, a company like NVIDIA, a chip company worth $4 trillion. That company on its own is worth way more than the FTSE 100, the entire FTSE 100. And then you've got several others that are worth more than the FTSE 100 in the US stock market. So it's how does Europe find itself being not just a consumer in the world, a sort of passive consumer buying Chinese manufactured goods, using American technology? How do you add a bit
and
to
whether
that?
it is by protecting your own companies and industries in the way that the US is trying to.
I suspect the UK and the French might take slightly different views. I mean, the UK might say, let's buy cheap Chinese cars. That's the way to make yourselves rich. And the French may be saying, how do we protect Renault and Peugeot and Citroën to make sure they're not wiped out by the Chinese? And so the British and French on that have tended to take slightly different views.